Welcome, podcast listeners. We have a brief update before we begin the episode. Dr. Melissa Miller and I are recording this on Monday, September 12th. Since we recorded the episode early last week, there's been a development in the regulation of monkeypox testing. Melissa, can you tell us what's changed and how this will affect laboratories that test for monkeypox virus?
Yes, as luck would have it, EUA was declared the day after we recorded our podcast. So I hope we didn't jinx it, but here we are. So even though the public health emergency for monkeypox was declared on August 9th, and it usually coincides at the same time with EUA, it did not this time. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services just recently on September 7th declared authorization of emergency use in vitro diagnostics for monkeypox virus detection. Now, remember that EUA is intended to make diagnostic testing widely available and to increase nationwide testing capacity. And so that's really the need that was seen at this time. So the policy and the guidance in the policy that came from FDA on September 7th includes guidance for manufacturers as well as CLIA certified laboratories. For the manufacturer, the FDA states that they intend to prioritize certain requests for EUA, including high throughput tests, tests with home specimen collection, or rapid diagnostic tests, and they specifically mentioned from experienced developers. For tests developed and performed in CLIA certified laboratories like mine, the tests have to meet certain criteria, but then the FDA just asks us to notify them in an email with specific information, which includes laboratory-specific information and test-specific information. But they don't ask for a formal EUA application, as was done with COVID-19. Now, to meet this criteria for this notification pathway for CLIA certified laboratories, the test must be a PCR-based test. You should be testing only lesion swabs, and it needs to be appropriately validated, of course. And the notifications have to occur either within 5 business days of starting testing or within 5 days of the guidance being issued, which by the time listeners are listening to this will have passed for those who were already doing lab-developed testing for monkeypox. So this was really welcome news for those of us in CLIA labs who experienced the EUA process during COVID-19, and it really does seem to be a nice balance between FDA being aware of the testing that's available and how much test capacity there is in the U.S., as well as allowing CLIA labs to perform LDTs without any great obstacles for monkeypox detection.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that timely update. And I think when people listen to the episode, they'll understand this even better. So let's go ahead and do that. On to the episode. Thanks, Melissa. There are a number of regulatory proposals under consideration in the United States, which could have important effects on clinical microbiology labs and clinical labs more generally. First, the VALID Act would change how clinical tests are regulated, with particularly important implications for laboratory-developed tests. Second, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services has proposed changes to the educational requirements for lab directors under CLIA and additional changes that would increase the fees that clinical labs pay to CMS. If you've been waiting for someone to explain these changes and how they could affect your lab, you've come to the right podcast. Welcome to Editors in Conversation. Please subscribe to this podcast and rate or review it. This podcast is brought to you by the Journal of Clinical Microbiology, available at jcm.asm.org and on Twitter at jclinmicro. I'm your co-host, JCM Editor-in-Chief Alex McAdam. This podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology, which publishes JCM. If you're thinking about publishing in JCM, you'll be interested to know that ASM members can get up to 50% off of publication fees. And I am joined, as always, by my co-host and fellow editor of JCM, Dr. Elli Theel from the Mayo Clinic. Hi, Elli.
Hey, Alex. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Excited to get into the meat of all of these proposed changes.
Yeah. We're talking about the regulation nation today. We're also joined by a good friend of the podcast, Melissa Miller, who's been a frequent guest. Dr. Miller is the director of clinical microbiology of the Clinical Microbiology Laboratory and a professor at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. She is also the chair of the ASM Clinical and Public Health Microbiology Committee, and she is a go-to person for all questions regulatory. Melissa, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, although I debate that last point.
And we're also joined by Mary Lee Watts. Ms. Watts is the Director of Federal Affairs at ASM. In that role, she oversees ASM's work with both Congress and the federal agencies, including the FDA and CMS, which we're talking about today. Mary Lee, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Delighted to have you. So let's just jump right in, and I'm going to start with you, Melissa. Just give us a little bit of background, if you would. Just remind us, please, how are laboratory-developed tests currently regulated? We're going to be talking about LDTs quite a bit.
Yeah, so most laboratories develop, validate, and maintain, right? It's just not the development of the test and validating it, but we continue to maintain these tests under CLIA regulations. So these were enacted in 1988. And under CLIA, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, has oversight of labs and LDTs. There are some states that have different rules where they have state-based review systems, like New York State and Washington State are two of these, but most states do this under CLIA. Our labs are inspected at least every 2 years for CLIA compliance. And, when we're developing these tests, we're doing our usual sensitivity, specificity, accuracy, precision, inhibitory substances, reference range, those types of things to make sure we're offering accurate and quality lab developed tests. So in effect, we're acting as a manufacturer of the test. Although to differentiate us from the manufacturers, most labs are only offering the testing locally. We're not marketing these tests, we're not selling these tests. And that's very different from some of these commercial companies that have made the news as of late. Now, to further complicate things, the FDA has stated that they've had the authority to regulate lab-developed tests through the Medical Device Amendment Act of 1976, but that they have chosen to use enforcement discretion when it comes to LDTs, which means they've basically decided to kind of leave us alone. This is outside of the EUA process, which some of us are familiar with from COVID testing. And I'd say that, these lab-developed tests have become a mainstay for a lot of our laboratories. It's a lot in molecular diagnostics, but also serology testing. I'm sure Elli can tell us about that, and other areas of microbiology. They become really critical to patient care, but they're low volume. So companies aren't going to invest in an IVD product for most of these applications, and these trials are very expensive. So we're left to develop these tests for our patients in labs like ours when there aren't commercial tests available. I'd also argue in some cases our lab-developed tests actually perform better than some IVDs. So that's also a consideration when there might be only one in vitro diagnostic or IVD test available. What's been unfortunate is that there have been some high-profile commercial companies that have taken advantage of what I might call the LDT loophole to market and sell kind of sham tests. And we're familiar with the Theranos debacle. I think it led to something like 16 counts of fraud between Holmes and Balwani. But more recently, Mark Shana was actually convicted of several different fraud schemes of a total of $77 million related to COVID and allergy tests through this Arrayet Corporation. So it's unfortunate situations like that have created an environment where the need for regulation exists. And it ends up being a balancing act of keeping the bad guys in check and maybe not onerously regulating some of our labs like us on the podcast. So I'm not exactly sure how you strike that balance, but that's where we are. At the beginning of COVID, when EUA was enacted, a lot of us, and I being one of the strongest critics of FDA and the EUA process, we said, this is delaying our ability to offer our lab-developed tests to our patients. It was close to a month for us and our LDT. However, we learned when serology tests were not subjected to EUA, what a complete mess that was in terms of poor quality tests being put on the market. There were also molecular EUAs that were submitted to FDA from CLIA certified laboratories, and these labs had not done a sufficient validation. So while I would like to say that the COVID EUA process showed us why FDA should not regulate LDTs, I think it actually showed us careful oversight's likely needed. And so where that oversight comes from and what it looks like, I think is what's up for debate.
Thank you, Melissa. And just to put this in context, I'll ask you in a sec, Ellie, but my lab does a number of LDTs, and they are all PCRs for various viruses that affect primarily immunocompromised children. And we do that because at the time we started them, there was nothing commercially available. And so if we wanted to offer those tests and supported patient care, we had to. Ellie, are you doing LDTs in your serology area?
We are. We do a number of LDTs for fungal antigens, for example, as well as a number of LDTs for some tick-borne and mosquito-borne pathogens. They, there's not a lot of interest, I'd say, in companies to go through the full validation clinical trials process to get these FDA cleared. So there's a lot of LDTs in serology as well.
Thank you. And Melissa, I know you do a number of LDTs, but I just wanted to take one specific example, and that's one that's very much in the news right now. What's the status of monkeypox testing in terms of LDTs?
Yeah, I mean, monkeypox, where we are now, so we're under a public health emergency, just like we were at the beginning of COVID. But even though the PHE has been declared, EUA has not yet been declared. Usually they go hand in hand. In this case, there's been a delay. There's not an EUA for monkeypox yet. So some of us have developed or modified the CDC test as a lab-developed test and validated it in our laboratories. But the scenario is much different than COVID, right? The case count is much lower. I think fewer labs are developing their own tests. And I think a really important point is the CDC made their protocols publicly available early on. And I think this is a model that could work with emerging infectious diseases going forward. Don't gatekeep the CDC protocols. There are many academic labs, reference labs that can develop our own LDTs, but to provide uniformity and some level of quality that we know exists with a well-established CDC protocol. I mean, this protocol was used by the LRNs. Provide a protocol for us. If there's reference material to validate, or specimens when possible. And it's a way to really, in a public health emergency, assure quality without enacting an EUA process. So we don't have an EUA yet. It's unclear if we will see an EUA unless Mary Lee has heard more from that since I last heard. With case counts going down, maybe we won't have an EUA, but what that means, if you took the CDC protocol and modified it, if you're using the same primers and probes, what the template will be to submit, we don't have that information from FDA yet.
Thanks, Melissa. So Mary Lee, let's turn to you and start with the VALID Act. Can you start by telling us what VALID actually stands for and how the regulations in the VALID Act relate to those in CLIA? Would VALID replace CLIA? It's a lot of questions, but we're starting with the basics.
Sure. No, and I do think it's important to understand the history of this debate because, as Melissa alluded to, for about 40 years, there was very little change in how FDA reviewed these tests. So the VALID Act actually stands for Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act. Congress loves to do fun acronyms with their bill names. So that's the current bill that is under consideration in Congress. But I think it's really important to understand that VALID is just the latest in a series of proposals and iterations that have been introduced and discussed really since 2014. And that was the year that under FDA Commissioner Peggy Hamburg, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health released a framework for FDA oversight of laboratory developed tests. And this is what we were talking about earlier, where FDA really made the case that they should go beyond the enforcement discretion that they had been deploying for about 40 years and instead look to require pre-market approval of some of these tests. And then once that happened, it was the floodgates for legislative proposals followed. And I think, too, it's important to go back and think about that at the time, FDA put this out there and there was some debate over, does FDA proceed with a rulemaking process and it avoids Congress? Or is this something where Congress needs to intervene? And for a while, it wasn't really clear what role Congress might have, given that there was legislation in place that technically allowed for this oversight. But interestingly enough, FDA asked Congress to intervene. They felt as though it would strengthen their hand to have congressional and legislative support for taking this additional step. And so as you can imagine, as legislative proposals started to emerge, the community quickly mobilized and became a really heated debate, and 8 years now on Capitol Hill, and they still haven't gotten it quite right. It's extremely complicated, and I think it's questionable if Congress, frankly, can legislate something this complicated. And I think we're really seeing the complexity as we're trying to improve what's out there and think about what this means for infectious disease and how to mitigate the challenges that this could present for our members. I think it's also important to note, Melissa mentioned that you had these bad actors out there. You had the Theranoses and others. But it also really was not driven by infectious disease. The thinking here was driven by, advances in cancer diagnostics and the fact that there were genetic tests on the market. So people were making life and death decisions and major treatment decisions around the results of these tests. And infectious disease was really just swept up, I guess, in the current of this. And that's one of the challenges that we've been facing, is this idea that you're trying to legislate something on a one-size-fits-all when infectious disease testing could not be more different from cancer therapy testing or genetic testing. To answer your question, Elli, about, how it works with CLIA, that's been another area of intense debate because we do not need overlapping regulations. And as we know, our labs do a considerable amount of regulatory oversight from CLIA. So it was really important that if FDA were going to propose, or Congress were going to try to propose additional regulations, that they work in tandem and they're complementary. Fortunately, I think that the current bill has gotten to a better place there. I do think the bill under consideration right now is designed to work in tandem with CLIA. It would not replace CLIA, and there is a provision now in the current bill that specifically says you cannot overlap, you cannot replace CLIA provisions under valid. So we were happy to see that just because it does provide that clarity. FDA's role here would be to assess the clinical validity of any test. And you all know this far better than I do, but the accuracy by which it identifies, it measures, predicts the presence or absence of a condition. And CLIA is really designed to oversee the laboratory, the equipment, and materials and the analytical validity. And so I think the balance they're trying to strike is ensuring that all those different types of validity are assessed at a level that the agencies believe, and the proponents of this legislation believe, ensures patient safety by having accurate and reliable tests.
Thank you, Mary Lee. So I think we have a good understanding now of where Valid came from and how it would fit or interact with CLIA. And we're going to come back to some of the problems with understanding with the clarity of Valid. But before we get to that, can you give us an overview of how the Valid Act would actually change the regulation of laboratory developed tests, including the LDTs?
Sure. So it's a significant change. And I think perhaps the most significant change is that it uses a risk-based framework to assess whether a test would or would not go through pre-market approval. So high risk and low risk. And again, this latest iteration put back in a moderate risk level. This is something that's come in, it's come out over the last 8 years. And there are exceptions to this spelled out in the bill as well. But generally speaking, high risk tests who meet a very specific criteria in the bill, again, these are life or death harm for the patient at a certain degree. I mean, it's quite specific. Those are the ones that would have to go through pre-market approval. The low risk tests would not. They would be able to be, continue to be offered. However, all tests, high, moderate, and low, would have to be registered with the FDA within a fairly short time frame, 1 to 2 years, which when you think about the sheer volume of tests that, especially our large academic labs, and Elli, Mayo Clinic, my goodness, thousands and thousands, that's a considerable regulatory burden on a lab. So there's the risk-based framework. There's also something that was added to the latest iteration that we're really concerned about, and this is the creation of a user fee program. One of the challenges that the agency faced in proposing additional regulation is that there really wasn't a good way to pay for that the oversight. It takes people, it takes time, it takes resources to do that. And we all know that they have user fee programs for prescription drugs, generic drugs, biologics. There's no such thing right now for tests. And there is a proposal in the bill that labs that would be putting these tests through that approval would also have to pay a fee. Right now, there's no distinction between a commercial test, an academic, a nonprofit. Right now, it's written as if anyone would have to pay a fee to be determined, and that's of great concern for us. I think it goes without saying that's a serious financial burden on the laboratories where ASM members work. There is a 5-year phase-in period before the provisions would take effect. So the proponents in Congress believe that is time to adjust. Again, I think it's kind of up for debate whether that is sufficient, but that is something it would have labs start this process within 5 years. I think those are the major buckets. There also is some technology certification provisions in the bill, but I think that's probably less applicable to the individual clinical microbiologist in our labs at this point.
And just to follow up, Mary Lee or Melissa, is there any kind of escape valve for those of us that already have tests set up in our laboratories? Are we going to get a free pass on this?
So there is a grandfathering provision. And again, that's been an area that we've been fighting for a while to try to extend. And so fortunately, all of the tests that are on the market up until the point that the bill would actually go into effect are grandfathered. However, those tests still have to be registered with the agency. Much better than having them go through pre-market approval, but there is still an actual, process that every lab would have to register those with FDA.
And so to follow up on that, so when you say register, does that just mean, the labs provide the information to the FDA and FDA puts them in a spreadsheet, or do they still have to approve them? So once we submit that information, do we just go on and proceed with testing, or is there a waiting period? Do we know? What does registration mean?
Right. Well, our current interpretation is that it's just a matter of getting them registered in a database. I think there it may become something that publicly accessible at some point, but it really would be a process for letting them know what test is being offered and a few points about the tests that are important. The reason for this, FDA says that they don't have any idea what's out there. They have no sense of the LDT market because they haven't been formally regulated by the agency. So this registration process is an attempt to get a handle on what's out there and what's being offered and why.
Thank you. So Melissa, with all this information, how do you think clinical labs should or would change their approach to LDTs if VALID is ultimately implemented?
Well, based on what Mary Lee just said, I'm going to hurry and finish a bunch of validations. And then anything that's left, I'm going to send to Mayo. That's it. That's my answer. No, I'm just kidding. In terms of validations, right? I would think like what we are all doing is thorough enough, right? And that nothing would change in terms of how we validate. But that obviously depends on the templates provided by FDA for the submission, right? This happened with COVID EUA. There were a few things that we did a little bit differently. We had to go back to, so we conformed with these documents. Like, for example, like we may have only done in silico analysis for some of the specificity studies, but FDA wants wet lab data. I know that happened with some of the Zika EUAs. We often use probit analysis for our limit of detection, but FDA wanted 20 manual replicates for limit of detection. So it's things like that in terms of our approach to validation that may have to change. I think the bigger issue is kind of what I said before, right? Will we get rid of LDTs altogether? And some labs might decide to do that. I would say it would be a gross impact to our patient care to get rid of all of our LDTs, depending on how you define an LDT, right? Is it one test that we create from scratch? Is it one in which we've modified an FDA cleared or approved test? Is it that we use different sample types in an IVD test? And exactly, what does this grandfathering mean in terms of which types of tests? Are all infectious disease tests going to be considered low risk? This is something that we've argued for both from the ASM and IDSA side. So I think the devil's really in the details on what the submission process entails. How much does it cost? I mean, we have no budgeted funds to do these submissions for these lab developed tests. We have no infrastructure for these submissions. It'd be me, myself, and I, putting together these applications, which, obviously I also have other things to do. So I think it's really potentially a paradigm shift in the types of testing that we do. I think it's a paradigm shift in thinking about how we can respond to emerging pathogens. I think it might restrict us in some ways and therefore kind of impact patient care on a local level. We developed a monkeypox test, again, based upon the CDC protocol that was publicly available. We could clearly have sent it to a reference lab. We could send it to Mayo. We could send it to LabCorp or others. And for us, it was less about the volume of the tests and more about the turnaround time we could achieve by doing it locally, right? And controlling how the specimens were collected and submitted. And we have access to the patient chart, right? That a reference lab doesn't have access to. So we can have that extra level of quality by being able to look at the epi, by looking at the clinical scenario of this low positive that might need to be repeated. So I feel like doing tests locally in general and applying it here to LDTs provides an added level of quality that we may have to give up. But I think, again, it depends on what the details end up being and valid or the next version of valid that we see.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, this option of just sending to reference labs is not ideal from the perspective of the staffing shortage that all of us are experiencing and having to take tests down. So having smaller labs send to larger labs because we can afford to do all of these regulatory, reviews and submissions is also, it's not the answer either. So,
right.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'm scared, and I'll probably sleep poorly tonight. And a lot of lab directors listening to this are probably going to lose some sleep. Mary Lee, where is the VALID Act now? Where is it in the process of review and potential approval?
Sure. Well, first of all, I hope no one loses sleep over this. But I can certainly understand why. And I hope you all know that those of us at ASM and our colleagues in the field are working very hard to try to address this in a way that makes you not have to lose sleep going forward. But we do understand that this is worrisome. And as a result, we've been really, really busy for years now, but particularly in the last few months to try to address this. So right now, the bill really is in a holding pattern. We're in kind of a weird space legislatively right now with it, and that's because it is sort of has had momentum on one side of the hill, on the Senate side, but has not had that momentum on the House side. And as you all know, who've had Civics 101, at some point the House and the Senate have to agree for something to go across the finish line and become law. So one thing that's also made this interesting is that one of the main sponsors in the Senate is Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina, and he's also the top Republican on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which has jurisdiction over FDA and to which this bill has been referred. So this year, Congress has to authorize the FDA user fee programs. I touched on that a minute ago, and it's one reason why Valid got some momentum in this process, because there is a proposed user fee program in the bill, and they thought that being FDA related, it could move with a larger FDA bill. Every 5 years, Congress has to reauthorize the user fees on drugs and biologics, and it's really one of those pieces of legislation that's called must pass, because they have to let FDA staff go if they can't pass it. So September 30th is that deadline. With Valid being a priority for Senator Burr, he attached it to the user fee bill while that committee was considering it, and it passed through the committee attached to the user fee bill. That's where it's still sitting. It has not gone to the Senate floor, in part because there are some disagreements in the larger bill around other items not related to Valid, but there's also some questions about Valid. And one of those is the extent to which categories of laboratories, like the ones that ASM represents, to the extent to which these would apply to them, because I think that user fee program really worried a lot of people and generated a lot of pushback. So in the Senate, it's waiting. It's waiting to go to the floor. On the House, their committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, went ahead and cleared their FDA user fee bill without Valid included, because again, that committee was not ready to deal with Valid. There's still a lot of concern, and they didn't have consensus. And so the House has actually passed a user fee bill now without Valid included. And so now we're at a point where the two chambers really have to reconcile that. Given the deadline of September 30th, I think that we're going to end up, and this is me looking into my crystal ball at the moment, I think we're going to end up with a user fee bill that does not include Valid, because they have so few legislative days this month. They're not going to sort this out, and they're going to have to pass this bill. Therefore, the chances for the bill to really move this year hinge on what happens at the end of the year. Senator Burr is retiring. This often means that retiring members of Congress get their way at the end of the year. They have priorities, and there are lots of bills that Congress tries to rush through, particularly after an election, including spending bills. But
and
there are a
was
number.
One of the initial sponsors, correct?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So we're watching very closely to see, what happens there. Again, they're going to have to come to an agreement with their House counterparts, and we haven't seen that yet. It's really anybody's guess. I think a lot of us feel as though we're not going to resolve these problems in the short time we have left, and that's going to buy us some more time. Here with Valid, is the issue going away? No. It's been going on for 8 years, and it's going to continue. And even if Congress can't get it together and can't, pass this legislation in some shape or form, FDA could decide that they want to just do this through the rulemaking process that the agency can do. Whether or not that's better for us is up for debate, but it might actually be a better situation, because you would have people closer to the process with more subject matter expertise considering it than members of Congress, who we know are not microbiologists and are not as expert on these topics. The other thing I'll just mention really quickly is that we have worked very hard to develop a good working relationship with the folks at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. As Melissa knows, the COVID situation really brought us in close contact with them. over and over the last 2 years. And so the groundwork is laid for us to have a good dialogue should that come to pass, whether it is legislation passes and then FDA has to interpret it and run with it, or whether FDA goes the rulemaking process. That was a very long answer to your question, Alex, but nothing in Washington is simple these days.
I'm not sure it's going to prevent my insomnia, but thank you.
I gotta say, I wish I paid more attention to my government 101 class, but that was...
I don't think it would have helped.
I don't know. So all that being said, Mary Lee, what has ASM done in response to the VALID Act? Again, we only have like 30 minutes, so I know you guys have done a lot of work on this, but can you summarize kind of what the big issues you've tackled have been?
Sure. So we've been involved in this for several years, but we've stepped it up a lot in the last couple of years independently. And I also want to know we've found a very strong partnership with IDSA on this topic, because together, our two organizations really bring the perspective of infectious disease, which is unique and is certainly timely with COVID. So our strategy has been to come to the table and try to improve the bill that has momentum, which is valid. We have written letters. We have held numerous meetings with members of Congress and their staff, both on the Senate Help Committee and on House Energy and Commerce Committee. We have brought in experts like Melissa and her colleagues to bring the lab perspective, the in the trenches perspective, if you will. And we've also issued action alerts to ASM members to weigh in directly with their members of Congress. And I'm proud to say that our VALID Act action alert set a record for member engagement at ASM.
That's awesome.
That's terrific.
Melissa?
Anything to add, Melissa?
I would just say get involved, right? Just don't sit idly by and assume Mary Lee is going to solve all of our problems. Although I have complete faith in her, to be honest. But, participate in Hill Day. I did an in-person Hill Day prior to COVID and several virtual Hill Days since then. And it's a little intimidating at first. You've not done this before. You're talking to congressional staffers and in some cases the members themselves. But even if there's not a specific topic you want to talk to the office about at that time, especially your local offices, your representatives, your senators, for me, right? It's pretty impactful. Senator Burr is one of my senators, that you establish that relationship. And so they get to know you, they get to know. And I've had a few staffers come to me with questions as things come up. They remember you, they come to you for expertise. So we like to say, like during Hill Day, you're really developing a relationship to continue that conversation as things come up. Mary Lee mentioned the action alert. I would just recommend, you certainly can send the form letter as it is, but if you can add any level of personalization to it, especially locally, something going on in your lab or specific to your institution. As scientists, we're used to thinking about data. Well, I hate to say it, but Congress thinks about anecdotes. So little personal stories that really not that you can't also mix in some data there, but personal examples of, how something impacts your lab or the constituents, the patients that we serve or their constituents, right? So just get involved. That's don't be scared. Do it. You'll learn a lot in the process and ultimately, I think, be able to inform our congressional offices for the better.
Thank you. And all right, at the risk of elevating listeners' blood pressure further, let's turn to another group of regulatory changes. The Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services issued a proposed rule in July, and this would affect clinical laboratories in a couple of ways. Let's start with one of those, and that is it would change the requirements for directors of high complexity laboratories. So, Melissa, can you tell us a little about what those changes would look like?
Sure, and I think my pulse is going up a little bit now too. So let's first clarify what we mean as lab director under CLIA. So the director of a high complexity laboratory is what we're talking about. So you can either go through the physician route, so an MD, DO, for example, and they're certified in APCP or have, different pathways of experience. or a doctoral degree like a PhD or DRPH, who is then also certified by an HHS approved board, of which there are 9. And one of the 9 is the ABMM board, American Board of Medical Microbiology, which is overseen by ASM. But there are 8 other boards, right? So the proposed rule as the Doctorate of Clinical Laboratory Science, so this is a professional doctoral degree, the DCLS, as an acceptable degree to be a medical laboratory director, which in the past has not been seen as equivalent to the MD, DO, and PhD, DR, PhD route. So we did write a letter to CMS, which I'm sure will be linked at some point in this podcast, highlighting the reasons why we believe this isn't an equivalent degree or pathway to a medical degree or PhD when it comes to laboratory directorship. So I think the key, there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter about this.
Yeah.
The key is the definition of lab director, right? We're talking about a medical laboratory director being board certified. To put it in context, so the professional doctoral DCLS is not an acceptable degree for the ASM CPEP postdoctoral fellowship programs in medical and public health microbiology or immunology, nor is it acceptable in the experience pathway for the ABMM board exam. So that doesn't mean that a person with a DCLS degree cannot carry the title of lab director, but these are administrative lab directors. So the equivalent name at my institution is a lab manager, but kind of the head lab manager who actually has a master's degree, not a doctoral degree, is the administrative lab director. So we're just drawing a distinction here between the person who's medically responsible for the highly complex laboratory, whether the physician or PhD, DRPH route. We've done clinical fellowships that prepare us to be board certified medical directors, which is not the same pathway as a DCLS degree awardee. There's also concern about a person graduating from a DCLS program and the proposed amendment to be considered as a lab director without having board certification. And this is inconsistent with the current standards. And it was our position that we think that not requiring board certification kind of degrades the overall quality that we're looking for in a lab directorship because you're diluting the importance of board certification. And 8 of the 9 boards that are HHS approved, they not only require, right now, MDDO, DRPH, or PhD. It's a lot of letters.
It is.
Degrees, but also additional experience or fellowships prior to the board certification. So, our concern is, why is this now being proposed? And the thought is that, they're trying to address laboratory shortages, right? We've been very vocal about shortages, but those are really at the tech level, right? At the bench level. And I've not seen any data, and there haven't been any data provided that there's actually a shortage of medical directors that they're trying to address here. And the proposed amendment, they also mentioned there's certain master's level graduates who could become lab directors or sit for board certification. So, in the letter, that we wrote, and many other organizations, AACC is another one that wrote a very nice letter, has the potential to kind of impact the quality of the medical direction of high complexity laboratories. And it's not really alleviating kind of the big issue in shortages, which is kind of the tech level.
Thank you, Melissa. Mary Lee, anything to add to that? What's the ASM view on this?
Just to add that in addition to the concerns that Melissa articulated about the changes in the personnel standards, there's also proposed increase in fees for CLIA certified labs as part of this rule. And that's certainly an area of concern, again, given the current climate that we're operating in.
Yeah, that's another thing that increases one's heart rate for for sure. So what, Melissa, what concerns has ASM expressed about the effect of all these, the fee increases in particular, will have on clinical testing?
If I remember correctly, Mary Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, it could be up to 20% increase in lab fees, correct? So
That's
I mean,
right, across the board.
pretty significant. So, my concern is what it really looks like on the ground, right? So we not only have these increased fees to CMS, but we also are dealing with decreased reimbursement under PAMA, right? So Protecting Access to Medicare Act is PAMA. So you combine these, we're already operating, on a very slim operating margin. What is this impact to any of our labs, but to smaller labs and to kind of health systems? So for example, UNC, we have our main campus here in Chapel Hill, but we have 15 or more, I keep losing track of how many there are. We might be up to 70 now, hospitals that are affiliated with us. And many of these hospitals are in a very rural part of North Carolina. So when you talk about, some of them are big community hospitals, some of them are very small community hospitals. So you're talking about, increasing fees and decreasing reimbursement. At some point, you have to make an operational decision on whether these smaller laboratories are going to continue to exist. So then they have to send testing to either us as a reference lab in the system or to Elli as a reference lab at Mayo or LabCorp or whatever their reference lab happens to be. But then you're taking away, local laboratory testing from rural areas. And in many cases, these are underserved populations that we really want to get to. These are the populations we sent mobile vans to do COVID testing. And so now we're taking away much needed laboratory testing in these communities. So it impacts the patients, it impacts the physicians caring for them. And the issue is, sure, there are some tests that are amenable to sending to a reference lab and doing batch-based testing, but there are others that you need a really actionable time frame. You need that result locally for that patient. And so if we can't keep these hospital labs operational, it's no question going to affect our patient population.
Yeah, and that's exactly how we articulated it in our letter, that, we recognize there's never a good time to raise fees, but given all of the points Melissa just made, the current climate, inflation right now, shortages of personnel in labs, this is a particularly bad time to make this proposal. And I just would add that in addition to up to 20% increase more or less across the board, the rule goes into a lot of detail on changing methodology. It really depends on your lab and what how your lab is operating and what waivers it may have in place. So for every individual lab, the exact increase might be different, but generally speaking, we're looking at probably 20% for most.
Wow.
That's a lot. All right, last word to Mary Lee. Melissa encouraged us all to get involved and talked about Hill Day and the importance of clinical microbiologists really speaking up. How can listeners do that? How can we get involved with ASM's efforts?
Great. Well, I would say it is imperative that ASM members make their voices heard alongside the work that we're doing every day here with the society. I mean, you all are the ones in the trenches. You can speak to the practical level from a close-up perspective about what regulatory changes or legislative changes would mean for patients and for laboratories. And so there are a number of ways to get involved. The very simplest, as you can go to our advocacy page on the asm.org website, and you can sign up to be part of our advocacy alerts. So this means that you would get our advocacy newsletter, which comes out once a month. And then you would also receive action alerts on legislative issues such as VALID, regulatory issues such as the CMS comments, And we have a system through our website where you can go in and you can weigh in with your members of Congress, or in the case of the comments we just discussed, with agencies, in a system that makes it easy for you. It provides you with a template, but then you can personalize that and hit send, and it goes right to the correct members of Congress based on your zip code, or it goes to the agency. And then we are doing periodic Hill Days. We've been doing a number of them this year focused on individual issues. So as Melissa mentioned, we did one where we had a number of our clinical microbiologists join and really talk specifically about clinical issues before Congress. And so we do have those opportunities. And again, when you are part of our network, if you will, then we are able to find you and we're able to offer these opportunities to you. But I just can't emphasize enough how important it is. We really can't do it without the partnership with members like all of you.
Thank you, Mary Lee. Well, Elli, do you think our next episode should be on stress reduction techniques?
I don't know. It's got to be on something more lighthearted for sure.
Well, that
I'm
was
definitely not
extremely-
appropriate for that podcast.
I'm sorry. I'll probably never be invited back now.
No, we'd love to have you back. This was really informative, and this is,
It was.
I don't want to make light of it too much. This was really informative, and this is really important stuff. So, Mary Lee, Melissa, thanks so much for joining us. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thanks for listening.